this video, I want to speak about contrast ratios, and touch on the inverse square law. In our last video, we spoke about hard and soft light, and I want to dive a little bit deeper in this video into that concept. The video might be a little bit dry. I did script the video, but I decided that after reading it, I thought it would just be better to show you. So if we look at the definition of contrast, we know that there are different use cases for them. We could have light contrast, which is what we would be speaking about mostly in this video, the difference between the highlight and the shadow side. But we could also have color contrast, which could be contrasting colors on the color wheel. There's also spatial contrast and texture contrast. But for this video, we are purely going to focus on the contrast of light between highlight and shadow. So as you're looking at me right now, we have the light coming from the one side, it's very bright, and this side is very dark. So we can say that this is a high contrast image. But if we use our examples from the last video where we spoke about soft light, so I have a very big soft light source here, and that is creating the soft light, but it is a high contrast image. Now, if we wanted to have a low contrast image with soft lighting, what we would do is have to fill in the shadow side. Before we get into those examples, I do want to touch on the inverse square law. We're not going to get super technical. All I want to tell you and show you is that essentially what it means is that as we move further away from the light source, the light is going to get less bright and less powerful, but very, very quickly. So let's show you a visual example of that. Okay, so that is the inverse square law. If we want to reduce the contrast, we could do one of two things. First thing would be to bring in a fill light. I'm just going to grab this big polyboard over here, and as you can see, as I move it in, I'm going to bring it in right super close to me. We've reduced the contrast. Soft light, low contrast, right? If I change the side to black, we're back to the high contrast. There is something else that you can do. And for this, you're going to have to adjust your exposure. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go stand further away from the light and show you using the concept of the inverse square law, where we are not in the bright part of the light, but rather in the darker parts, or should I say the less directional part of the light will actually be softer, even though we're moving further away from the light. I know it's counterintuitive to what we learn with being further away, but what people forget to mention, yes, if you take a light source and you move it further away, relatively speaking, it is going to be much, much smaller. But what that light is doing, it is bouncing around the room, and that is creating that sort of full light and softening and flattening the light. So often when we're shooting in the shade or in the shade of a building, you've got beautiful, evenly lit subjects, and what you could do in those instances, if you moved closer to the side where the sun is coming from, then you could sort of increase the ratio from highlight to dark, thereby creating more contrast. Or you could actually go closer to the building and then turning the subject away from the light and creating more of a contrasting image that way, still within the soft light. Okay, so let me show you this. Once the exposure is adjusted, we can see that the light is soft and even with little to no shadows. You can see the characterization of the shadow on the background, which is really soft and diffused. Okay, so now let's alter our light, make it into a small hard light source, which can either have high or low contrast. And this is a very, very important concept to get your head around, because often we immediately think that a hard light is hard contrast, and while it could be, it doesn't necessarily have to be. So let's have a look. Okay, so here we have the light with no modifier on it. It is just the bare bulb, which would technically be your hardest light source. Obviously the light is spilling around the room. It's not creating. I just want to jump in right now and show you what I mean actually on this picture, where we've got a freeze frame is the hard shadow line on my neck, and we're going to compare that to the previous set up with a soft light, and you can see how soft that shadow line is. Much fill because it's not a very powerful light, but the difference here with the hard light and the soft light is the shadow edge. So with a soft light source, with a large soft light source, even though you could have a high contrast image, the shadow edge is going to be softer and slightly more diffused. With the hard light source, you're going to have a much more defined shadow. But again, that doesn't mean it has to be a high contrast image. So let's pull in our white polyboard. Okay, so there you have all of that light that is basically bouncing back in with a similar intensity. Obviously, if this was silver, we could pretty much create another light source and it would look almost the same, basically flat light. So using this, we can craft the image that we want based on whether we want hard light, low contrast, I know counterintuitive, or soft light, high contrast. There's one more topic that I want to talk about before we wrap this video up, and that is the concept of contrast ratios. And that is a way to quantify the difference between highlights and shadows. And we can use this to create consistency either throughout our shoot or throughout our looks, whatever it is that we are trying to achieve. It is more commonly used in cinematography and filmmaking to get consistency and continuity between shots. So what we can do is use a light meter. You could eyeball it, it's a bit tricky, but let's use a light meter and see if we can get a 2:1 contrast ratio, and then see if we can measure the background and get a contrast ratio on that, and then do it with hard and soft lighting. Okay, so we're going to start with hard light. Yeah, so here is my trusty light meter, and if we measure the highlights, I've got 7.1. So let's try and get this to, let's call it, if we can bring it in just slightly. .1. Okay, so it's at f8. So if we want to get a 1:1 ratio, this side of my face would have to be at f8. It's at 4.5. So a very common contrast ratio is 2:1. So that is a one-stop difference between the highlight and the shadow side. So we would go f8, 5, 6. Okay, so I'm getting 5, so it's pretty close. And now if we wanted to get the background at a 2:1, it would also have to read at or around 5, 6. So the background is sitting at f2.2, so that's well below what I'd like it to be. So there's one of two things that we can do. Either we can bring in another light source, or we can move our entire set further back. So let's bring in our set further back, just because I'm using one light and I'd like to keep to using one light just for the sake of simplicity. Okay, so we're getting f8. We've got to bring this in a bit closer. Okay, so we have f8 on the highlight, we have 5, 6 on the shadow side of my face, and we have 5, 6 on the background. So if we went to another room, or for whatever reason we had to refilm this on a separate day, knowing the lighting ratios, we could very easily get back to that starting point. And obviously we could do the same thing with a soft light source. This is a really, really good tool to know. You can even use this concept to break down lighting that you would like to emulate either from your favorite photographers or favorite movies. All you would have to do is use either a false color chart, a little bit more complex, but the idea is still the same. A false color chart is essentially a graphical representation of the different exposures in the image. So for example, if I say something is at f8 on my skin, that might read at the pink or the grayish color on the false color. So that is it for this video. If you like it, please do give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Please leave a comment in the section below. I love to hear from you guys, and we'll see you in the next video.